make the case that the Bible is true. It's informed, it's corroborated by all this human experience of the supernatural.
Hey, you guys. Another episode of Unrefined Podcast. And I have here in the house with me both BT and Lindsy, our hosts, with this wonderful show that we call Unrefined. And today we are going to dive deep. And I got to say, you guys, this book that we're about to talk about and this author that we're about to talk with is fire. I mean, it's amazing. I've read thousands of books, and I wish I would have had this book probably back in my early days of when I was reading Jack Deere and John Wimber. It would have helped me so much. But let me introduce our guest. His name is Matthew McGuire. He received his education in biblical studies at Crandall University in Canada and New England Bible College and Seminary in Bangor, Maine. Stephen King land is when I read Bangor, Maine. Anyway. He is a graduate of bilingual Bible program at El Instituto Bíblico Palabra de Vida, Buenos Aires, Argentina. In April of 2024, he published A Magical World, How the Bible Makes Sense of the Supernatural, which is what we're talking to him about today. He lives with his wife and his 4 sons in Androscoggin County, Maine, and is actively involved in lay ministry in his local area. He attends the Vineyard Christian Fellowship in Mechanic Falls, Maine. So, before we really get deep into this, I want to read this quote. And I just think this quote is an encapsulation of your book, but also where we want to go from and to. And it's from that Meditation in a Toolshed by Lewis. Is that all right if I read that, guys?
Go for it.
All right. I was standing today in the dark toolshed. The sun was shining outside through the crack at the top of the door. There came a sunbeam. From where I stood, the beam of light, with the specks of dust floating in it, was the most striking thing in the place. Everything else was almost pitch black. I was seeing the beam, not seeing things by it. Then I moved so that the beam fell on my eyes. Instantly, the whole previous picture vanished. I saw no toolshed, and above all, no beam. Instead, I saw, framed in the irregular cranny at the top of the door, green leaves moving on the branches of a tree outside, and beyond that, 90-odd million miles away, the sun. Looking along the beam and looking at the beam are very different experiences. But this is only a very simple example of the difference between looking at and looking along. And when I read that, this is, to me, a great encapsulation of your book. And, listeners out there, as we talk about some of the things we're going to talk about in this podcast today, I want you to move from looking at from the outside to looking in that beam and to experiencing some of these things that we're talking about. This is just not an exercise in head knowledge. Seek these things, which we'll get into as we get along. Well, some of them we don't want to seek, but we'll get there too. But anyway, so Matthew, I'm going to start off the question and let the guys jump in anytime they want to ask questions or whatever. What got you started with wanting to write this book?
Well, hey, Brandon, thanks for having me. We really relate in a lot of ways in these things. And it's interesting with C.S. Lewis. He's undergone a renaissance in the last few decades, and his way of combining intellect and imagination, I think, is what gives him that staying power. And that's really what I try to do. For my background, I grew up fundamental Baptist. We believe the Bible was the sole authority in life.
King James only?
Really, well, there's a story behind that, but we were not King James only by the time that I grew up in there. The King James only church is a few blocks down the street.
Praise God.
So with that background, I grew in maturity with various things. When I first got my first study Bible, that was a big thing for me because I saw that there was so much more to learn than I was getting in Sunday school. And really, what got me interested in the topic of the supernatural was I went to a Bible camp, a very strong Calvinist Bible camp. You don't have many of those. They don't do invitations. They don't raise your hands. Good Calvinists.
Yeah.
And for some reason, the guy who was in charge of it, he invited a charismatic guy to be the program director. So it was this beautiful combination. And that guy, that director, he ended up becoming my best friend over a period of years. And he slowly talked to me about not only his experiences, which are fine, but also about the biblical background behind them. So I came to a point in my Christian life where I realized it's not just the Bible people that experience miracles. It's not just the people in the Old Testament that heard the voice of God. This is something for us today. And I thought to myself that here is a way that I can have a knowledge of God that it doesn't contradict the Bible, but it informs how we read the Bible. So you mentioned John Wimber and Jack Deere, those gentlemen, Sam Storms, R.T. Kendall. A lot of these authors really help fill in the gaps for me between supernatural experience and my Christian faith.
So that led you to write this book. And so was there any certain circumstance that you were like teeter-totting, like, I'd really like to write this book, but then this event happened and I'm like, I'm definitely doing this? Do you have any kind of a story like that? I've noticed a lot of authors have those epiphanies, sort of. Did that happen to you?
Absolutely. It really came in bits and pieces. I know the first time that I was involved in this charismatic house church, the first time I actually started seeing the things that I was reading about in books, I witnessed firsthand not only accurate words of knowledge, the one guy just speaking things that he could not have known by natural means, and I also saw what I'll call an attempted exorcism. I'm not an expert. I don't know, if you know that it was fully successful, but it was very unnatural, very concordant with what I saw in the biblical pages. And I became known in that church as the chronicler. I would keep like a miracle journal. I'd write down all the things that would happen. So I always kept these things written down in one form or another. And as the years went on, I started getting interested in religious experience in general. I would read, non-Christian authors talking about all the evidence for the paranormal, all the evidence that the mind is more than just the brain. And I thought to myself, I want to have a Christian take on this subject of the paranormal and the supernatural that would be an invitation for non-believers or even Christians to consider all that God has put out in this world.
Yes.
Hey, Matthew, could you unpack the words supernatural a little bit and just kind of, the usefulness of the term and maybe contrast it with paranormal a little bit?
Yeah, so supernatural is a very slippery term, and I hesitated to put it on the title of the book. But because it is the common way of saying, an act of God or of a ghost or of a demon or a spirit, this is what people typically mean. Now, of course, there's got to be some way that it all fits together. And this is talked about in chapter 1 of the book, where I talk about the objection that miracles are violations of the laws of nature. But really, in the big picture, whatever we call supernatural and whatever we call natural, it all fits together somehow in a way that we might not understand. So in reality, everything is all part of one, law of nature, one type of nature. But the term supernatural is a helpful term that helps us distinguish the work of spirits in the spiritual world upon our physical world.
Yeah. I noticed that too when I was reading through it. The distinction you drew between paranormal and supernatural, and I had never really drawn that distinction. And correct me if I'm wrong, I interpret it like that paranormal tends to be more people that are looking for the whole famous quote that one man's magic is another man's science later on. And I kind of saw paranormal as encapsulating that, whereas supernatural is something like that's out of this realm. No way it could possibly happen without some kind of something coming from outside of what we naturally know. It's really hard to define that word, but I never realized until I was reading your book that there could be such a distinction. Can you kind of hone in on that, the distinction you draw between paranormal and supernatural?
So the term paranormal is funny because that also means different things to different people. There's an author, Chris Putnam. He talks about promissory naturalism, which is the idea that anything paranormal eventually will find a natural explanation for it. That's what the skeptics will say of telepathy or clairvoyance or the gift of prophecy or miracle healings. They'll say, well, eventually we'll find something for it. But for other people like me, I put it close to the way that I use the word supernatural. It's not explained by our normal laws of physics, our normal ways of understanding the universe. So if you're watching, those ghost hunting shows, they'll call it paranormal. But other people might call it supernatural. I use the terms not so different in my book, but the common parlance is sort of what you said. Supernatural is way beyond paranormal, is that weird gray area.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you this. I want to dive into certain subjects. We obviously, I don't want to go through every chapter of your book because I want people to read it, and I'm going to promote it, and I've been promoting it, and I'm going to continue to promote it because it's good. And Lindsy and I, for years, and then I've been discussing this with BT as well because he was a practicing esoterist, and he can give you the background of all the stuff that he was involved in. I've been trying to develop a theology of, okay, how do you explain that people can operate in the supernatural like there are spiritual laws, like gravity is a natural law or aerodynamics, but also in the spirit world, there's spiritual laws like sowing and reaping, law of reciprocity, different like, quote, spiritual laws that seem to be able to be used by anybody. And, and two, you really resonate with me, Matthew, because I grew up, I read that Watchman Nee book, The Spiritual Man? I think is what it was called. And he had a real propensity to say anything done by the soul is demonic. And
the latent power of the soul.
That book too.
His view is very interesting because he thought this is a natural power of the human soul, but because of the fall, it's off limits. It should be kept in the lockbox.
Yeah. Okay. I didn't know that. That's fascinating because there's been a massive influx of, New Age stuff over the years. And interestingly enough, I have this issue that it seems like to me that New Age people have a lot more faith in a benevolent universe to provide and to care and to do all these things for them than we do for a benevolent, good God to take care of us. In other words, they tend to believe for more positivity, more things than we do as Christians, if that makes any sense. And I was like, that should not be so. We have the God of the universe on our side. And so, I've really been like praying into and exploring all that kind of stuff. And your book really went into that. Will you kind of go into that, how you can distinguish between, the different paranormal events? And we can even lead into the whole talk about ESP. That's really where I want to go next, if that's okay with you.
That's a good place to start. So one of the things that being involved in the charismatic renewal was, now that I had seen spiritual power firsthand, when I saw other people, even non-Christians, talk about their experiences, I would not just write them off. Like, oh, you're just a nut. I talk about in the book, this one lady came into our storefront church and she's telling us, oh, that guy's got a purple aura. That guy's got a yellow aura. That means he's angry or whatever she was saying. And, a couple years before, I would just call her a nut. And it is possible she was a nut. But I also considered, maybe something's really going on here. And one of the concepts that was very difficult for me to wrestle with is, as Christians, everyone seems to believe there's evil spiritual power. A lot of us also believe there's positive spiritual power, especially those that believe the Holy Spirit gives us those gifts. But the real struggle is for people to acknowledge that there is basically some built-in power of the human spirit. So the fact that I speak in the book about family members of mine that had premonitions of the future, some of them were Christians at the time, some of them were not, and the premonition came true. And usually it's of a death or something like that. I talk of other people from other books where they pick up on the thoughts of others, and they're not occultists. They didn't seek out any demons. It just happened to them. And one of the things that I develop in the book is natural aptitudes of spiritual sensitivity. And like any talent, like good speaking, good athletics, or good writing, you can submit that gift to God, or you can take it in what I call preternatural directions. An evil spirit could take advantage of that and amplify it.
Yeah. That's what really intrigued me with that, because that's questions that I had and we've all discussed and talked about. I knew there had to be some kind of a latent power in us being human beings that was paranormal or supernatural, that was neutral, that was not either demonic or, quote, godly. Because I'm not a Calvinist. I don't know if you are, Matt, or whatever, but I'm not a Calvinist. I'm kind of a hodgepodge. I'm Anglican, so I can be like that. But I don't think we have to have permission for everything that we do for God and et cetera, et cetera. And that's okay when people do. But I tend to think that it was like, okay, God, what kind of wisdom do I need to have to do this and then operate in the power that he had? But like you said, a lot of those precognition events happen to the people. And, I've encountered people growing up that had all these events, and they weren't occultists, they weren't Christians, they weren't anything, but it was obvious that it was happening to them. And it was also obvious, and this I think is significant, you talk about this later in your book, that the fruit was good. The devil's not going to give you said this one time in your book, the devil is not going to ask you to forgive somebody. That's just
right.
That goes against his nature. Mm-hmm. So we'll get into that with the ghosts and stuff. So tell us about your studies of ESP and what you've discovered. And, don't tell us the whole book, but obviously just give us a taster of what you've come to learn about ESP.
So what really spurred this on, there's this massive tome. It's called Irreducible Mind, and it's edited by Edward F. Kelly at the University of Virginia. And they have carried on the research that started 100 years ago with the Society for Psychical Research. And they compiled just a huge amount of evidence. Their goal is to show that the mind is more than just the brain. And we can look at this through studies of telepathy or clairvoyance or remote viewing. And right up front, I have to calm some fears, because all those words are buzzwords in the church, as maybe they should be, because usually it's occultists that use those terms. But when I say those, I'm referring to just extrasensory perception, which is any kind of information that comes to you through the medium of your soul and not through your ordinary five senses. And it seems, based on everything that we have researched, that it happens to people of all stripes and not just people that are fortune tellers and things like that. Of course, maybe some of those fortune tellers started out as just having this natural sensitivity to the spirit world, and then they took it in an evil direction. But the evidence for ESP comes in two kinds. Number one is spontaneous case studies. So people have these very vivid premonitions or dreams that come true, and you can look at them in all the details. Those are not so satisfying for the skeptic. They want laboratory studies. So the other kind of evidence we have for ESP is predictive card guessing, or the Gansfeld studies, where someone tries to transmit information from one brain to another, and they're like in different buildings. And what we see in those studies are not 100% accuracy, not even close, but they're so far above chance as to, the next card that they predict, or, the next image that they say, that it's like 1,000,000 to 1 above chance. And even more than that when you add all the studies together. So there is empirical evidence for ESP. What is interesting is that it's not as repeatable as you would think. It's very on the margins, and only a few people are extremely gifted in being able to guess the next card.
So that it's similar to spiritual gifts in the sense of, like, in 1 Corinthians 12, the gifts are all listed, and I come from a vineyard background when it comes to this, that those gifts are given, like John Wimber used to always say, you're like a plumber, and you ask for a wrench and the Holy Spirit gives you a wrench. You ask for he gives you whatever you need in the moment. But I've also noticed in being part of the charismatic movement for 20 some odd years, that some people can become familiar with certain gifts, and it's like they practice it so much that it becomes easier for them to flow in. Does that happen with, like, what you're talking about with ESP and all that as well?
Absolutely. And you'll see in the book, I talk about some specially gifted people, like in the Pierce Pratt series of tests. And, just in my own life, I have family members that are very sensitive to spiritual things. And I constantly ask them, hey, what's your sense on this person or this situation? Because they just seem to have a sense for it that I clearly do not.
Well, something that really jumped out at me about this ESP that you were talking about that gives me, I guess, encouragement with this for some of the, the discernment ministries that would say, oh, it's all occult, it's all the, demon in the gaps, which we can define that in a second, what that means. But Sally Ryan Feather, in one of her books, she was talking about what's love got to do with it. And I thought that was really a fascinating correlation between a lot of the ESP stuff. It seemed to activate more powerfully when love was involved. Can you elucidate on that a little bit?
Yeah, so that's a very interesting touch point for looking at ESP in the context of the Bible and of the nature of God. So if ESP was just some random, thing of the universe that we didn't understand, if it was just the product of chance and laws that are just above what we understand, you wouldn't think there would be a connection of meaning or a connection of love. It would just be random. And a lot of ESP does seem to be random, but there's a very significant proportion of these premonitions. It's almost always about a close friend or family member. So one of the examples I cited was my mother had this dream of one of her close friends exactly in the situation she was on her deathbed, or at least with the diagnosis of her illness. And she knew that she was going to die in that dream, but she didn't think too much of it. And then later, a few months later, she found out that friend was diagnosed with a terminal illness. And then a few months after that, it ended up being 1 year after the premonition, it all came true and all the little details were the same. Now that didn't happen. She didn't have a vision of like some random guy in Oregon, it was one of her close friends. Why would that be? Why is extrasensory perception geared along a track of love? And then we can look in the Christian tradition of this sense of love connecting people, not just at a physical level, but at a soul to soul level. And that really seems to give us some hints as to what's really going on here.
Well, and to explain to everybody what you mean by the phrase, he uses this a lot in the book, you guys out in the audience, demon in the gaps. Explain to them what you mean by that. And yeah.
Yeah. So back in the day, in the medieval time, it might be sort of a caricature, but the idea was if we couldn't explain something in the natural world, we would say, oh, well, God's doing that. God's, the planets are not rotating on the way that Ptolemy predicted. Well, maybe God's, nudging them along. So the God of the gaps. But as science progressed, those gaps got smaller as we understood the universe better. So in many ways, Christians do the same thing. Whenever they don't understand something supernatural, they think it's a demon. Oh, you died and you saw a bunch of spiritual beings? Must have been a demon. It must be a demonic illusion. Or you had this premonition about someone across the country and you had to call them and they were asking for you, or they were thinking about you at the time. Maybe that was a demon. Whatever it is, we often jump to the demonic explanation before we consider other options for a good reason, because we're afraid of people becoming involved in the occult and things like that. But I think it's frankly, it's a lazy way of looking at the supernatural, and it really shuts off any chance to dig into this and dialogue with unbelievers.
Yeah, it's lazy and just dismissive. It's just a wave away answer.
Yeah.
Matthew, it reminds me of this story about Robert the Doll. Have you heard about this one?
I have not.
So Robert the Doll belonged to this guy, Gene Otto. And you guys can look this one up, but
fascinating.
This doll was given as a gift to Gene by his aunt as a playmate. And there's stories about people would hear two voices in the bedroom when Gene was playing with Robert. There would be things moved about the house. There were typical broken toys, and Gene would say, oh, well, Robert broke, so I could only play with this one. And then the aunt comes by and says, hey, why don't you guys just lock Robert in the attic, because Gene shouldn't be playing with his doll all the time. Well, she dies the next day. Natural causes, quote unquote. And that leads a lot of people to some weird and suspicious, acquaintances with the doll. And even today, it's in a museum Florida, I think this was in Key West, Florida. And
creepy looking little thing.
Very creepy, very old doll. It was made in Germany. But this is the most interesting thing is a lot of the skeptics who investigate Robert the Doll come to the conclusion that most of this was done by Gene and some kind of ESP connection, because the stuff associated with it isn't directly saying, hey, this is definitely demonic. There's something else going on. Gene seems to have these other latent abilities where he had dreams of the future, premonitions, places not to go, and one would draw the conclusion this isn't, this is a mental ability that he's projecting into an inanimate object. Have you, Matthew, read anything that would come to some kind of conclusion that the human mind with ESP can do things like this?
So it's interesting you bring that up, especially with the phenomenon of poltergeists. A lot of parapsychologists will say, well, it's not a separate spirit. It's just the power of the human mind or the spirit. And they will say it's psychokinesis. So if you ever seen like a movie or a show where someone can move stuff with their mind, well, it's like that on steroids, where a lot of these incidences of objects moving themselves, they say, oh, well, it's this, psychologically disturbed teenager with a bad upbringing, and they are reacting and causing all this stuff to happen. I am not well qualified enough to make a judgment on that. I don't think it makes sense of all apparitions, maybe of some.
Well, and two, you talking about Robert. I was just thinking about this when BT was talking about this. Is Robert in the museum now that he still has like supernatural paranormal things happen to him. And I wonder, and we'll get into this when we get into the ghosts section later in the podcast, but I wonder if even after the grave, what was the guy's name that had owned Robert? It was, what was it, BT?
His name was Gene.
Gene, yeah. I wonder even after his death, if he still had that possible ESP connection to this doll. And we know of Nephilim / demonic things being attached to objects, Pazuzu, yes. All that kind of stuff. So I wonder if that's the case as we get into the ghost section, that's not necessarily evil or good. I mean, and I agree. I agree with Lindsay. I think it's really lazy for us just to, try to make everything so black and white when there is gray out there, particularly in the Bible. I tell people all the time, I used to think everything was black and white, and in God's eyes it is, but in our eyes there's a lot of gray. There's tons of gray because we're not God. And I think this is one of those examples that we don't know, but I don't think we need to be afraid of it. I told somebody yesterday on a Facebook post that I have more faith in God to deliver me than I do in the devil to deceive me. And Christianity, at least evangelical Christianity in the West, doesn't have that. Now, Catholics and the more liturgical tradition, they do. They understand the power of God in a different sort of way than us, even charismatic evangelicals do, which is to their credit. But the whole ESP phenomena has always intrigued me because, like you said, it seemed to have happened. And then you'll have this with people. You have really devout Christians, but they have their folk religion stories, like that and it's not really folk religion, but they're little anecdotal stories that they tell that doesn't fit their religion and their doctrines and stuff, but yet they'll swear that they're 100% true. And that really comes in with ghosts, which we'll get to. But that the same thing happens with ESP, right, Matthew? I mean, you have people who have encounters and they don't know where to talk to or who to talk to because you go to a pastor, it's a demon.
Yeah. Yes, and I was told of this story of a prominent, I guess you could call her a medium or a fortune teller in New Brunswick, Canada. And as a young girl, she would see spirits and she would get these premonitions. And when she went to the Pentecostal church, they just tried to cast a demon out of her. And when that didn't work, they basically, she just wasn't very welcome there talking about it. So she ended up becoming an occultist, and now she offers her services to people.
Wow.
So as Christians, we need to be sensitive to this. Even in just a pastoral way, people have these gifts. You can call them gifts, you can call them aptitudes, whatever it is. We need to be sensitive that that's a real thing.
Yeah. Aptitudes. I really like that terminology. That's and I asked somebody just in passing the other day, it reminds me of this. I said, supposedly, I forget the percentage, but we have like a really small percent of our brain that we use, like what, 10%, 20%, something like that. Somebody can help me there. But I wonder how much percent of our brain we use before the fall. I mean, what if part of the fall drastically reduced the latent power of our soul that God gifted us with these? Because in a non-fallen world, all these things would be good.
This is exactly what Watchman Nee says in his book, The Latent Power of the Soul. And I think Nee is guilty of a lot of speculation, but I think it's helpful to imagine. He says things like, and we know that pre-fall Adam was at least 1 trillion times as smarter as average humans today. I'm like, how would you know that? How would you possibly know that?
Yeah.
But he does point out some things like, the power of the human soul to communicate wordlessly, all of that was built in. And really, as humans, we've been diminished by sin. And this leads to the next point, which is in church history, I pull up Puritans like John Flavel, and he has this idea of celestial telepathy. And his idea is right now we have bodies. And so that kind of impedes communication from one soul to another. But we still have these moments where we have soul to soul communication. He says you can't deny it. And then he takes this a step further and says, when we enter into glory, into the eternal state, we'll be like the angels and we'll be able to communicate without any words at all. Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking to myself, he wrote this 300, 400 years ago. And this is exactly what people with near-death experiences report. They communicate without any words at all. Tolkien had a similar idea in his fiction of Osanwe, which is basically mind-to-mind communication. And he wrote that the body is an impediment to this. And when the soul is released, that communication can take place. And of course, he's writing fiction, but he always had a interesting connection between the real world and the fantasy world, where he was drawing on truths in creation to create his world.
Lewis did the same thing, I think. I mean, they both were pretty connected with, you see a lot of that drawn into Lewis's fiction as well, particularly The Great Divorce and stuff like that. But, I don't want to go into too much detail about deliverance because people have heard a lot about deliverance, but you have a chapter on that. And you said something really, really profound in there that I thought was that needed to be mentioned. You were just talking about the different aspects of part of the kingdom. This book is a kingdom book, in my opinion. I mean, it's called The Magical World, but it's very much about the kingdom of God and it making progress in the world, and then us beginning to explore, to me, things that are on the peripheral that shouldn't be on the peripheral that we should know more about. I mean, I do agree that there's several times you say the secret things belong to the Lord, and that still needs to be, an anchor that we have there. But you were talking in the book about the Manasseh people, their experience of baptism into the Christian faith being an effective protection from the power of evil spirits. And I wanted to ask you about that. Would that be infant baptism or just baptism in general? And to me, that would almost prove the sacramental aspect of these acts that oftentimes evangelicals just make light of. Which, anyway, I have an aura story about that, but I'm not going to tell it. But what do you think about that, Matthew? Does it matter if it's infant baptism or believer baptism, or is it just the nature of the sacrament? What would be your opinion?
Mm-hmm. So my argument and my observations are not specific to a credo or a Paedo-Baptist tradition. It sounds like they were in the Anglican tradition in those Maasai tribes when they were baptizing the young. I didn't focus too much on, are the sacraments, effective? Are they memorials? I don't really get into that because I want this to be available to everyone. But the bottom line is that these people converted to the Christian faith. and they were protected from this powerful demon that the rest of the tribesmen were not able to rid themselves of. They had, you have to keep in mind, every tribe around the world has its own witch doctors, its own exorcists, and they supposedly, they were able to deal with the run-of-the-mill demons. But then apparently there was this very powerful demon that was affecting many in the tribe. And of course, how do they know all this? I don't know. But they were not able to get rid of this demon, except the Christians that had been baptized into the faith. So a lot of them were just like, hey, let's convert, let's baptize our families, perhaps baptize our children. And they were able to be protected. And a similar thing happens when I point out Father Sama'an Ibrahim in Egypt, where the Muslim imams were not able to exorcise demons. So they would send their people, or at least the people would go, the Muslims would go to the Christian priest, and he would do the exorcisms. Because they're like, well, when we need some extra muscle, we go to the Christians because they have the best exorcists.
That's really cool. It's that story's usually told the other way with missionaries. It's like a lot of cessationist-oriented missionaries over in foreign countries, and the people couldn't get, which you talk about this in your book as well, they couldn't get help from the Christians, so they had to go back to the witch doctors, which weren't able to help them as much. And I think that's why, having the body of Christ really embrace the supernatural power of God, like you're talking about, is crucial.
That leads me to a good question for Matthew. In the worldview or Weltanschauung section, you talked about kind of 4 categories of, I guess, engagement with the supernatural there. Could you go into those?
Yeah, so this was specifically for people that take the name Christian. And what I've noticed is that it's not a clear, you guys believe in the supernatural, you guys don't. It's more of a spectrum. So at the beginning, I talk about people that are just cultural Christians. They don't really believe the supernatural stuff in the Bible. They probably would not affirm the resurrection or the virgin birth. They're just, polite Christian society. We're not really concerned with them. And as far as I'm concerned, if you don't believe in all that stuff, why are you even a Christian? But then when we get to the next category, which I use the word open but cautious, I borrow that term from Robert Saucy. And there's people that are like the church I grew up in. They are Bible-believing Christians. They believe all the miracles in the Bible, but they're very skeptical, very cautious of modern-day experiences. But as I discovered, when you start asking people, even these very conservative people, they have a supernatural story to share. They're just typically not comfortable sharing it. The
next they couch it in different terms, oftentimes.
Exactly,
too.
Yeah. So a charismatic says, I have a word from the Lord that I need to speak to you. The Baptist says, God's really put something on my heart that I think you should hear.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've noticed that. You're right.
And then the next category I call limited practitioners. These are another step further because these people are involved with the ministry of deliverance. So people like John MacArthur, they say deliverance, that was only for the New Testament era. It's closed for us now. You just need to get people saved. Other people, like when I went to Bible college, the guy that founded the school, he was friends with John MacArthur way back in the day, and he's very conservative Baptist tradition, or at least one of those non-denominational types. And he performed an exorcism on one of the campers. It blew my mind. So there are people like that. Dr. Martin Lloyd-Jones, he was known for doing deliverances, which is very surprising for many.
Yeah.
Spurgeon in his healings.
Spurgeon in his healings, And Lloyd-Jones, he even received his sermon series directly from God. He was writing it down as God gave him the message titles. So these people, they still say, hey, I'm not a charismatic, but God works in supernatural ways all the time.
I just thought it was interesting that the middle 2 categories did have some people that we would call cessationists. They don't believe in the sign gifts, but they still function in some, not just believe in, but function in some sort of supernatural acts. I thought that was interesting. Don't give up on people, I guess.
Yeah.
And I am happy to work with them. I call them the charismatics in denial because they're doing all the same stuff, but they're just giving it different labels.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. So let's ease this discussion into something I'm really excited to talk about. If you guys are ready to move on, about near-death experiences. And I had an interesting question yesterday from a guy who asked me, what do you mean by near-death experience? And it was in a Facebook post, and I was kind of like, oh, wow. That is definitely too big for a Facebook post, and there's so many nuances and all that kind of stuff. So can you kind of give us like a layman's definition and talk about what you've learned through it? And then, yeah, if you'll just start there, please.
So if we want to define near-death experience, there is a term out there called the Grayson scale, developed by Bruce Grayson. And he puts up, I think it's either 12 or 24 common pointers to what we would call near-death experience. One of the very top ones is the out-of-body experience. So this happens when you leave your body. But your consciousness or your mind, whatever you want to call it, you're looking down on your physical body and you're floating around. That's very common. However, sometimes that happens without people being near clinical death. So it's not just that. There's other things that we would categorize under near-death experience. Another one is remote viewing, basically traveling when you're in that out-of-body experience or seeing things that you couldn't see in your normal body. Another one is seeing spiritual beings. Typically, the term that is typically used is beings of light, because it kind of obscures, is this an angel? Is it a deceased relative? Is it Jesus himself? Another thing that is common is the life review. People see their life flash before their eyes, oftentimes with the beings of light around them. Another thing is I know you're interested in this, Brandon, the peak and Darrien experiences.
Oh yeah. We got to go there.
we got to dig into that. So, but before we do, basically the near-death experience is very widely observed. It only became really popularized and recognized in 1975 when Dr. Raymond Moody published Life After Life. And it's no longer something that's just an old wives' tale. It's very well documented that people are leaving their bodies. They're seeing things they could not have seen just lying down there and comatose. So we know something's going on. The question is, what is it? Is this a demonic vision? Is it a natural thing that happens right after death? There's a lot of questions that come with it.
Oh yeah, definitely. So, wow, this is a huge topic, but let's dive into the peak in Darrien. I had somebody say Darrien's Peaks, and they looked it up, and that's actually a place down in South America or somewhere. Like, no, keep looking. This is Peak in Darrien, something totally different. So, explain to us what it is, and you guys, this is just a fascinating topic to me. So
it's interesting. The place in South America is where the term came from. The idea was of the explorers crossing this ridge and looking out west to this undiscovered country. So it's like we're taking a peek at what's beyond. So they use that term to describe a very particular circumstance where someone has the out-of-body experience and they see spiritual beings. But it's not just that. They see people that have recently died that they had no idea had died. So like, hey, what's Tom doing here? And then they come back, they're resuscitated by the doctors, whatever happens. And they're like, wow, I saw this person. I saw my deceased grandfather. I saw this guy. And for some reason, Tom was there. And then, the family members will find out Tom had just died 12 hours ago. Mm-hmm. So what is that? What are the odds of such a thing happening, except for the fact that maybe he really saw Tom's spirit?
Mm-hmm. I mean, and let's use Occam's razor. Let's use a little logic here. What would sinister forces get out of something like that? I mean, I guess they could possibly. BT, can you speak to that? What possibly, playing devil's advocate, pun intended, what could a sinister force get out of making something like that happen?
Making a out-of-body experience happen?
Well, no, not just an out-of-body experience, but this whole peak of Darrien, like making someone who just died and the person who had the out-of-body experience didn't know it, and they saw the actual person in their out-of-body experience.
Okay, I think I understand your question. Well, that's actually a really good question to ask, because Matthew, as you know, the demonic forces, we call them sinister forces, anything that's basically a fallen angel, a disembodied spirit, or a person who's acting in cooperation with them. That's sinister forces. That's what we use the word for. And there is no end of effort for spirits to seek out a human to manipulate. For the longest time, we could say up until really the new age, that exploration of the demonic realm was something that was really only done by practiced, polymaths or magicians. Nowadays, any demon really won't mind latching onto a person and helping them fall. I guess that's kind of the goal, clout in hell. But to answer the question, Brandon, I find that any of the sinister forces who want to gain some kind of better foothold in hell are going to seek out and manipulate people to believe that what they're seeing or experiencing is a good. And there's always some kind of lie or mistruth that's being advertised. But as a Catholic, though, I also err on the side that people who experience out-of-body experiences are most likely experiencing something. And I trust that what they experience is for them, like a private revelation kind of situation. So whether they're being told about, somebody's long-lost grandmother or so on and so forth, or whatever's happening, I err on the skeptic side, and I say, well, whatever you were told was told for you and not for the body of Christ first. And if the person's life has changed for the better, let's just say we take a person who doesn't really show a whole lot of conversion fruit. They're not showing any of the fruit of the Spirit, right? But after they have some kind of out-of-body experience, start showing the fruits of the Spirit, I'm going to go ahead and say that was probably a good for them. And the opposite is true. That would then be true. If they get an experience and then it's, I don't really need to go to church. I don't need to spend time in communion with my Christian brethren. They start going, it's just me and my Bible alone. And it becomes me and my Bible to me and my Sunday television alone to, falling away completely.
Yeah. Yeah. So it goes back to, and actually, Matt talks about this in his book, You Will Know Them by Their Fruits. It's like, we want to judge just the experience right instantly and classify it good, bad. Whereas, anything with God, sometimes it takes patience and time. And I have an out of body experience, a peak in Darrien, and I see Tom, and that I get out of it. And I know a lady like this. She was on our show, and her out of body experience, her near death experience, like totally transformed her life from drug addict to, she has so much love. And so that would be, obviously the enemy is not going to be pushing towards that. And which that reminds me of a story that you told in the book, Matthew, that goes kind of along with this about the forgiveness, but that's in the ghost section. Could you tell us that story? Do you know what story I'm talking about? About the was it your
Rod Dreher,
yeah. Could you tell us that story?
So, do we want to get into the ghost stuff?
Yeah, let's go ahead and get into the ghost stuff. Yeah,
all right,
let's go.
Buckle up. So, we'll just first add disclaimer. This is a topic that we're speaking of things that we can't really know for sure. There is a lot of speculation here. We got to be humble, but my opinion is similar to John Wesley's. He introduced a section in his journal about ghosts, and he said, listen, this is something that, it's controversial. Please don't be offended that I believe this. And I'm not offended that you don't believe it, but all the evidence points to this. So unless things point in a different direction and I'm convinced from the Bible or experience that I'm wrong, I believe that ghosts are real. And I had a personal upbringing where ghosts were either fake or demons. My dad had a really interesting ghost story, so that kind of always put a little asterisk on that. But a few years ago, about 6 years ago, I read this book by Rod Dreher, very conservative, like in the, he wrote The Benedict Option. Very popular author. He's an Orthodox Christian. And he wrote this story about how he went to his hometown when his grandfather died and, awaiting the funeral proceedings. And they experienced apparitions and poltergeist activity him, his mother, and his father all separately in that week. And the only thing that solved it was getting in a Cajun, really old Catholic priest and 2 Cajun sisters. And their discernment was that his apparition was hanging around. And this guy was a certified exorcist and everything. So you'd think, hey, you're a Roman Catholic exorcist. You've gone through all the stuff. You should know the difference between a demon and a ghost. So I try to give him that credit. But anyway, they ended up, one of the sisters found this picture in a closet, and she just had this sense that the grandfather needed forgiveness from his son, which was Rod Dreher's father. And when that father spoke the words of forgiveness in the presence of everyone, and when they did a service in commemoration, all the activity stopped. All the poltergeist stuff, all the apparitions, it all stopped. So my question was, first of all, how could a conservative Christian believe in this? Doesn't he know all ghosts are demons? But the second reaction after, digesting it a little was, wow, maybe something really is here where there's a lingering. When a soul passes away, it lingers for a little while. And there's a lot of, conservative objections to this. And I deal very minutely with the biblical passages that are commonly cited. But that kind of started me off on this journey of exploring the topic.
Yeah. I mean, you have the same story like I was talking about earlier. That you have your compartmentalized section where ghosts are usually fake or demons, but then you have your anecdotal section of real life. My dad experienced a ghost and he knew it was real, and I trust my dad implicitly. And I think all of us kind of go through that dissonance sometimes of that. And his part on the ghost is in the appendix, and it's, to me, was one of the best chapters of the book too, as well as the near-death experience. Yeah, and what I like is how you take on the whole aspect of, I'm a solid Bible-believing evangelical Christian, and yes, some ghosts are demonic, but some are not. And you took what Heiser believed and you took it further. Would you kind of go into detail about that, about what you believe as far as ghosts?
So Heiser is interesting because he's so well respected. He's really, even in the year after his death, which sadly he died while I was writing the book, he was a huge influence. And he is so popular right now for all of his efforts at getting us to re-examine the biblical text, not through creeds and traditions, but through the original audience's eyes. And he goes through great pains to show that these biblical authors, when God prohibited inquiring of the dead, that's because you could inquire of the dead. Or when, Samuel was raised up by the ghost mistress at Endor, that was really Samuel. As a matter of fact, the translators of the Septuagint explicitly say it was Samuel. The narrator in 1 Samuel says it was Samuel. And in the book of Sirach, in the Deuterocanonical books, says it was Samuel. So this was the view of the biblical authors for a long time before other people like Tertullian said it must have been a demonic imposter. And then in the New Testament, you have all these instances where the disciples think Jesus is a ghost. And ghosts were known. People thought there was a lot of ghosts in the sea because a lot of sailors died. So when they see someone walking on the sea, they're like, uh-oh, it's a ghost. Or ghosts come about after violent deaths. So in the post-resurrection appearance, they're like, uh-oh, Jesus is a ghost. He's mad. But all that goes to show that these characters in the Bible, they just took ghosts for granted as part of a supernatural worldview. And I also show this is universal. The ancient Mesopotamians in Babylonia, Egypt, ancient Asia, they all believed in ghosts. So to say that the authors of the Bible were the only people that had a less supernatural worldview, it doesn't seem to hold up to what the Bible actually tells us.
Well, in particular, knowing from Heiser himself that, I mean, and this offends a lot of really conservative people, but, the Jewish people borrowed from other countries. They borrowed stuff from the Sumerians. They borrowed stuff from the Babylonians, beliefs and all this kind of stuff. It doesn't mean it's wrong. I mean, that's what drives me crazy sometimes is that, just because something is not explicitly laid out in the Bible does not mean it's not true. And it doesn't mean that it's evil, and I see these two camps in the body of Christ. And there's one camp that if it's not expressly accepted, and in the scriptures it's false. And the other camp, which I tend to be in, and this comes from me probably being an Anglican and more liturgical and just different way of looking at the world, raised Methodist, is if it's not expressly forbidden in the text, then let's explore it and figure out the possibilities of it. And I think that personally, the New Testament is more the latter than the former. I don't know. What do you think about that, Matt? Did you understand what I was saying?
Oh, absolutely. And I think there is I speak in the book about especially evangelicals. There was a big reaction against ghosts because the Catholics were saying, oh, well, ghosts prove purgatory. So we took the knee-jerk reaction and we're like, well, all ghosts are just fake or they're demons. So you don't, I just took away your proof for purgatory. But that's not really a good, dispassionate examination of the data.
Well, and Rod Dreyer kind of, Eastern Orthodox refutes it. He's like, I'm Eastern Orthodox. I don't believe in purgatory, but there's still a place for all this. I like that part in your book. I thought that was really, it needed to be brought up, and that you can still buy a lot of this and not necessarily accept the doctrine of purgatory. I just think that there is a world, and I have this image of it like an iceberg, of that there is a world of the unseen that is so much bigger underneath the surface of the water than what we do see. And I think a lot of people think that there's everything we see, and then on the other side, it's equal with there's the unseen. And I just think that it's like I said, like the proverbial iceberg. There's so much more unseen than we'd ever dreamed. And your book just opened my eyes. I mean, I told Sandy last night, I was like, you need to read this book. It stimulated in me a desire to pursue the supernatural, not just investigating ESP or near-death experiences or ghosts or any of that kind of stuff, but also to pursue more healing, more deliverance, more exorcism, more of the signs of the kingdom, preaching and signs. And what did you call it, Lindsay, earlier? Charisma?
Oh, yeah. Charisma and charisma, if I'm saying that right. Charisma and charisma. It just has a nice ring to it, right. But it's just, word and power always go together. That really stood out to me, Matthew.
Yeah.
When I was reading your book, this is something that stood out, right? I mean, I'm gonna do a comparison, but I don't mean to make two pillars here. Where I started reading Dr. Heiser's book way back 2019, and it was nice. It was great because it confirmed a lot of the things that I had experienced and understood when I was in the esoteric occult world and doing my own form of witchcraft. And it confirmed that I grew up in basically a cessationist household, where the miracles stopped, so on and so forth, but somehow tongues didn't. But anyways, what I'm finding today is there's this monotheistic, therapeutic materialism in Christianity that seems to focus more on the material world as opposed to understanding that this is a rich environment. I mean, they completely disregard all of the metaphoria and move on to name it, claim it, blab it, and grab it. And your book showed me that I could look at this in a way that affirmed that this is a spiritual situation, that there's more going on than meets the eye.
Heiser has been a help to so many people in that way because he's spoken to the UFO guys, he's spoken to the esoteric and the occultists in ways that the church they're really behind the game. They're way behind the ball on this topic.
Right. Well, the difference, Matt, was here's an application, right? This is something that you can look at and examine in the real world, as opposed to here's some information, run with it. That was the difference.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a lot of anecdotal, and maybe that's the wrong word, but a lot of just examples of this, just stories, eyewitness testimonies. And when I was reading this book, I knew that this is not going to convince a hardened skeptic that has an anti-supernatural, and I put the emphasis on anti-supernatural worldview. However, this book would go a long way in convincing people that are on the fence, the people that have encountered things, but yet their denomination or their religion or whatever keeps them out of this. This book would definitely push them on the edge, because a lot of them have heard these other experiences outside of what is the normal charismatic evangelical type thing. And Matt has taken with this book and made it appetizing and made it something that we can get into, that we can digest, that we can believe in. And that was needed in the evangelical culture. I have a feeling this book is going to cause no short of probably good arguments, so hopefully more fire than heat. But I think it's great. Since we've come into the fringe world, I start so many evangelical conversations with talking about ghosts or near-death experience or Bigfoot or UFOs or this kind of stuff. And then I get into the biblical aspect, and they're like, wow, I've never heard, particularly I had this one guy with Bigfoot. I've never heard Bigfoot put in that category. So that makes sense biblically. So that could actually be real. I'm like, yes, it could actually be real. And Matt, you did that with this book. This book is, it brings these things into the realm of evangelical and doesn't demonize them with the demon in the gaps thing that we talked about earlier.
And Brandon, if we want to zoom out, I want to give people a key to understanding the book.
Okay.
This is, it is a sort of apologetics book, but it's a little bit different. You've got classical apologetics like, well, we have premise 1, premise 2, and then conclusion, God exists. All logical arguments. Then you've got evidential apologetics. Hey, A, B, and C happened, and according to the rules of history, it's likely that Jesus rose from the dead. You've got your presuppositionalists. This is a different approach. It's inference to the best explanation. My understanding is you've got all this data, all this human experience, and you've got a bunch of competing worldviews. So our question is, which worldview is going to make the most sense of all this stuff that's going on? So every chapter, when you get to part 2, every chapter is a 1-2 punch. It's kind of like, well, Craig Keener's Miracles was a 1-2 punch. The first punch is witnesses do claim to see miracles. The second punch was, I think these miracles come from God. In a similar way, every chapter in this book, the first punch is, here's all the evidence that ESP exists, or the gift of prophecy happens, or that demons are real. But the second punch is making sense of that through the worldview of the Bible. So now that we have all this information, we know, people communicate soul to soul. People are delivered from demons in the name of Jesus. People experience these life reviews, and a lot of them change their lives after a near-death experience. All this stuff put together, and by threading it all together under what the Bible teaches us, I make the case that the Bible is true. It's informed, it's corroborated by all this human experience of the supernatural.
Yes. Yep. That's it.
Yep.
Yeah, I do want to disclose to everyone that the book was more than just what we've talked about. It covers other topics such as healing, has an excellent chapter on healing, has an excellent chapter on prophecy, which I wanted to interject that is very, very applicable right now at this time period we're going through, with some failed ministries that were heavily prophetic, and a particular very prophetic minister. And then Jack Deere came out with a chapter in a book that he wrote about a lot of this kind of stuff, and it was pulled back, but it's come out. And so we're exploring all this prophetic stuff and exploring what does it mean to be prophetic in the New Testament. And anyway, his book doesn't necessarily hit on that, but hits on all these different areas of supernatural things. So it's not just about near-death experiences and ghosts and ESP. So I wanted to make that clear. It's a very full-orbed book about the supernatural, and it inspires you too. I mean, he's being modest with the apologetics. It is apologetics, but it also inspires you to begin to want to walk and see this stuff in your life. I mean, it did that for me. So it was a very inspiring book as well. So you did a great job, Matthew. I mean, it was amazing. So
yeah.
Well, Matthew, we're going to kind of wind this up. What I would like for you to do, if it's cool with you, is I would like for you to pray for us and our audience out there. Just however you feel the Holy Spirit, lead you to pray. Is that all right?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Dear God, we thank you for this group of guys. I thank you for their heart for you and for exploring the nooks and crannies of our world and in seeking to just show your character to those that are often unreached and often neglected. And I thank you for their desires to pursue you and all that you have for us. I pray that you would prosper the listenership and all the audience of this, that many people could benefit from it. And I just ask that all of us would be deeply impressed by your works in our lives. And we ask this in the name of your Son.
Amen. Well,
Amen.
Thank you so much, Matthew. Yeah, I would love to get you back on here. I have some ideas that I'm not gonna say them out now, but I'm gonna try to run across to you later on that I'd love to do with you if you're game to it, if you have the time. I know you're about to be super busy with this book, so because I know I'm gonna
anytime.
Promote it. I mean,
anytime.
Yeah. So thank you so much for your time, and we were honored with your presence on this show.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks for listening and supporting us. And remember, stay naturally supernatural.